Today we're going to be taking a look at the weapons and equipment of World War I. The Battlefield 1 trailer dropped last week, and after seeing that and researching the time period, I think that lots of us have discovered that the weapons, vehicles and locations were far more diverse than most people, including myself, thought they would be. Over 32 countries were involved in World War I in one way or another. Many of these countries had their own versions of weapons and vehicles, and as such you begin to realise that there is plenty of scope and base material to choose from when it comes to BF1. And I wanted to first talk about the weapons of World War I, what weapons were used by the main forces in the war and some of the history behind them. The First World War had some iconic weapons, and I imagine we'll be seeing a lot of them appear in the next battlefield. Now let me start by saying there were hundreds of weapons used during the war by all of these countries, so not all of them will make it into the game obviously, but let's start by trying to cover some of the ones we've already seen from the footage. There are tons of very talented people on the internet who've been able to distinguish many of the weapons in the trailer, so first I want to say props to everyone who had a hand in identifying all of the guns here. Let's start with pistols. How about the Colt M1911? This is a pistol used by the United States throughout the First and Second World Wars. It was developed in 1911, no surprises there, and was the standard issue firearm for the United States Armed Forces from 1911 all the way through to 1986 before being replaced by the Beretta M9. Even still, some law enforcement agencies do still use a version of the 1911, proving just how popular and reliable it is. Over 2.7 million 1911s were obtained by the US military during its lifetime. That's a lot of pistols. And over the course of its lifetime, over 28 nations would go on to adopt the 1911 as their pistol of choice. And with what we've seen in the promotional art for the game on the Harlem Hellfighters pack, I'm pretty sure it's safe to say we can confirm that this is in the game now, as well as that brief snippet that we saw in the trailer. Next we have the Mauser C96. Much like many of the World War I weapons, this German produced pistol was very distinctive. The integral box magazine in front of the trigger and the long barrel made it stand out from all of the other pistols. You might also recognise it from a popular franchise known as Star Wars, because our beloved Han Solo's DL-44 blaster pistol was based on the Mauser C96. The gun was actually in service since 1896 and stayed that way until 1961. Over 1 million of them were manufactured. In terms of Battlefield 1, we actually see this weapon on the key art for the game, so we can pretty much be sure that it's going to be in there. Moving on, as you may have seen from the trailer and the live stream, melee weapons will play a big part of the game, just like they did in the First World War. The brutality and close combat of the war made them a requirement for most soldiers. You'll see spiked maces, clubs, truncheons, swords and even shovels being used, as well as many other improvised weapons including bayonets. Soldiers would equip bayonets onto the front of their rifles for use in the trenches and close engagements. It really was a last resort if you needed it, and it saved lives and took lives of many soldiers. We also got a glimpse of a scimitar sword in the trailer. This sword originated in the Middle East and it was standard for the region and this time period. And this is where we get the interesting cross between swords/horses and more modern weaponry and vehicles. I even came across these really crazy Wolverine type claws when I was researching things. How mental do these look? Can you imagine running around the map with these on? Could certainly spice things up, and I wouldn't be surprised at some point if we see these in the game. Next, let's talk anti-tank weaponry. The Mauser 1918 T-Gewehr. This was actually the very first anti-tank rifle made, and its sole purpose was to destroy armoured targets. It had a lot of recoil as well. Imagine firing an armour-piercing steel core cartridge at high speeds towards a tank. Apparently the recoil and back pressure on this thing was so intense that sometimes it would injure the soldier firing it. The weapon was never designed to blow a tank up though, it was simply designed to penetrate and break key components to immobilise the vehicle. So what about machine guns then? Well, remember the Lewis gun from Battlefield Hardline, the Syndicate weapon? Well, that is also a World War I weapon. It was in service from 1914 up until 1953. It's a US designed weapon that was mass produced and adopted by the British military. It was the Belgians that first used it in 1914 before the British adopted it a year later as a replacement for the Vickers machine gun. It stands to reason that we may also see the Vickers machine gun make an appearance in the game. The Lewis gun was a pretty distinctive weapon, as I'm sure you remember from BF Hardline. It had a very wide cooling shroud around the barrel, and its top-mounted drum magazine really made it stand out. Now this gun was an LMG, and a big one at that, and so it was used both with a bipod in the field, but it was also attached to biplanes and even tanks as a turret-based weapon. The Pan magazine could hold either 47 or 97 bullets. This weapon will definitely make it into the game. We can see it being carried by the soldier in the trailer and also attached to the back of the Bristol F2B plane, and we also saw it in some gameplay behind closed doors. Other machine guns used during the war included the MG08 machine gun. Again, a striking weapon. It was an adaptation of the Maxim gun from 1884. This used a 250 round fabric belt and could fire up to 500 rounds per minute. This of course led to overheating, so how was it cooled? Well, with water of course. As you can imagine though, considering its size, its belt fed nature, and the fact that it was being water cooled, it wasn't particularly portable. Variants of the MG08 were made though to alleviate that problem. The MG08-15 for example was a lighter weight but more mobile version of the same weapon. Even then though, it was still bulky and still water cooled. And check this out too, an air cooled version of the gun called the MG08-18 was trialled a few months before the war ended. All in all, we could see a number of these versions of the guns in the game as both stationary and mobile versions. In fact, the glorious soldier wearing the armoured suit might be holding one of these himself. When you think of the First World Wars, you think bolt-action rifles, and of course they were present and in abundance. Let's talk about two that we know featured in the trailer, the Lee Enfield Mark III and the Gewehr 98. The Lee Enfield was a bolt-action magazine-fed rifle used mainly by British forces and the Commonwealth. It was used all the way from 1895 to 1957, and it actually takes its name from a mix of its designers, James Paris Lee, and the factory where it was designed, the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield, hence the name Lee Enfield. It's estimated that the total production of all Lee Enfields is over 17 million rifles. The Lee Enfield Mark III does appear in the trailer, as does the Gewehr 98, albeit very briefly. We did see the Gewehr 98 in the press gameplay, and it was equipped with a side-mounted scope, and we got to see it used a bit in practice with the sniper taking out 3 or 4 soldiers, and it looks very cool indeed. This rifle was a German-made bolt action, and it fired cartridges from a 5-round internal magazine. The rifle is named after its first year of manufacture, as many weapons during that era were, and as I said, we can see both of these rifles in the Battlefield 1 trailer. Now surprisingly, there were also a couple of early submachine guns used in World War I, so let's take a look at some of those now, starting with the Beretta M1918. And this SMG, as you can see, has a very unique design, but it can spit out bullets at a rate of 900 rounds per minute. Quite why you would want your magazine covering part of your line of sight though is beyond me. The M1918, as you've probably worked out by now, was made in 1918 and was first used by Italian forces. We also have the MP18 submachine gun, which was largely considered the first practical submachine gun to be used in combat. It was also introduced in 1918, no surprise there, and was used by German forces mainly in trench combat. And this gun actually ended production in 1920, but its design would influence later submachine guns for years to come. And I'm sure you'd all agree it certainly looks the part. This is another gun that appears on the hip of the soldier in the cover art, so we know it's definitely in the game. Next, we take a look at a shotgun that was to become known as the trench gun, for fairly obvious reasons. The Winchester 1897 shotgun. There was an actual upgrade a few years into the war that was designed specifically for trench warfare. It had the ability to attach a bayonet, which of course was much needed in the trenches, and it also had further protection over the barrel in a form of a steel heat shield to protect soldiers from burning when the weapon becomes overheated. Now, the use of shotguns was actually the base of a protest by Germany. In September 1918, the German government issued a protest against the Americans' use of shotguns, claiming that it was prohibited by the law of war, that they caused unfair and unnecessary suffering. Amazing when you consider at this point the war had already seen many soldiers dying from gas-based grenade warfare, which conveniently we're about to discuss. World War I was a brutal and horrible time for everyone involved, and gas grenades were an extreme but very effective weapon against the enemy. They started out as non-lethal grenades. Tear gas was used first in 1914 by the French, but it wasn't fatal and was aimed as more of an irritant. During 1915 though, Germany started using chlorine gas, which could do damage to your eyes, nose, throat and lungs. It could also cause death by asphyxiation. Over the course of 1915, Germans used chlorine gas many times against Canada, the British and Russian, to name a few. It actually prompted the Russian army to commission the study of poison gas shells, and despite the British being very vocal on their outrage, they too attempted a gas attack, but it was poorly executed and was a disaster. You could argue that the worst gas was to come in 1917. Mustard gas was not the most effective at killing, although it could be fatal in high doses, but it was the effects that it had on living organisms that made it so brutal. It was heavier than air, so it would settle on the ground and could linger in the soil for days, weeks and even months. If a soldier was exposed to it, it would leave them with external bleeding, trouble breathing, vomiting and blisters all over their skin. In some instances where it was fatal, it took soldiers weeks to die. Even the horses needed protection. After all, they were just as much at risk as the soldiers. A pretty rudimental solution for the horses, but at least it was something. And lastly for today, we do get to see what appears to be a makeshift anti-tank grenade. Basically, this was made by taking many stick grenades and combining them together to combat heavy vehicles like tanks. This is a real thing that we saw briefly in the trailer, and well, I certainly wouldn't want to be carrying one of those on my back running around the battlefield. As well as that, we of course cannot fail to mention the flamethrowers. We saw them in the trailer, and as we know, they did indeed exist in World War I, designed of course to flush out enemies from trenches and burn them alive. They were able to send out a long blast of fire, and the guy using it in the trailer looks pretty badass to say the least. The weapon itself is pretty simple though. It consists of two parts: the backpack, which holds the cylinders of inert propellant gas and flammable liquid. The propellant fires the liquid out of the gun, which holds the ignition system. You do not want to be on the end of that. Now, I'm sure that there are many more weapons in the trailer if we look deep enough, and definitely more that we'll be finding out about as more footage of the game reveals itself. And that's all for today, guys. I hope this video looking into the history of some of the World War I weapons interested you. I think we will see most of them in the game, and next time we'll be looking at some of the vehicles in the game, and let me tell you, some of them are pretty unexpected indeed. As always, thank you for watching, guys. If you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, thumbs down, and I'll see you in the next one.